right, welcome back, everyone. So you might remember the last episode we were talking about how, while this giant school board, nationwide school board, was calling on the Department of Justice and different branches of government to begin investigating parents as domestic terrorists if they, for example, hold protests against things like critical race theory and so on, or oppose the mask mandates, or oppose the vaccine mandates. They claimed they're being threatened, harassed, and so on. Well, the Department of Justice seems to be going along with it. I wasn't sure if they'd do it. But the Department of Justice has now announced that they are, in fact, going to be monitoring for cases like this. They claim it's going to be more focused on, threats and so on. But if you read the fine print, it actually seems broader than that. I'll be explaining this, a few other stories. Also, Google. So the government has now made it so that Google, allegedly, I'll get into the details of it as well. Secret source allegedly said this. Mainstream media reporting it. But folks, the government allegedly gave a secret order to Google to begin handing over information on people who have typed in certain search keywords on Google. So you might want to think twice about what you write on Google, what you're looking for, because names, numbers, certain correlations, or something like that may actually trigger Google to be handing your information over to the government. New articles on that I'll be going into. Also, an interesting development just took place. The NIH chief, Dr. Fauci's boss, just stepped down. The details of why he's doing so are not quite clear, but it is interesting, and I'll be detailing this as well as some other stories. And folks, that said, it's good seeing you all here. Elizabeth Valenzuela said, I don't Google. Yeah, it's probably a good idea. Jedi Knight, you say DuckDuckGo. Actually, I use DuckDuckGo as well as a Google replacement, but it seems that they're also kind of not that great these days either. They've kind of fallen into some of this as well. We'll see what happens with them, but we'll see. Molly John, he said Fauci needs to step down. There's a lot of pressure for it, actually. I'm surprised he hasn't just recused himself, essentially. With all this, we'll see if anything happens with that. But frankly, if his boss has stepped down, maybe something's coming for him too. We'll have to see. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the first stories for the night. I want to talk first about what's happening with the Justice Department now announcing, while they're going to be targeting parents, they're defending, they're not apologizing, they are defending their statements on this. Article here says this. Attorney General Merrick Garland, on October 4th, announced a concerted effort to target any threats of violence, intimidation, and harassment by parents directed towards teachers, toward school board members, teachers, and other personnel. Now, the way that this is being framed, if you read a lot of headlines, is, these evil parents are threatening teachers and school board members and so on. And, if people are threatening to hurt other people, they're threatening to kill them, threatening to go after their families, I think that does justify, of course, law enforcement to do something. But they have other things in here. It's also intimidation and harassment. And think of what harassment would entail, because what's happening is that parents are going to these school board meetings. It's a school board complaining about it, and they're, harassing them, i.e., asking them why they're teaching their kids this hateful rhetoric of critical race theory, saying their ideas of why they disagree with the vaccine mandates or mask mandates and so on. That is what is being framed as harassment. Protests. Parents protesting policies they do not agree with. And the government now is saying that they're going to be launching a concerted effort to target this. Now, again, violence is being used as the main reason for this concerted effort, justified. But intimidation and harassment in the forms of normal protest may be wrapped up in this as well, according to the wording, the loopholes within the wording. Now, the announcement comes days after a National Association of Teachers and a National Association of School Boards, asked the Biden administration to take, quote, extraordinary measures. Remember that? They asked him to take extraordinary measures. This is a national school board to prevent alleged threats against school staff and the association that the association said were coming from parents who oppose mask mandates and the teaching of critical race theory. So if you don't like your kid being separated by their race, by the color of their skin, which they are doing at a lot of schools, if you disagree with this, if you disagree with the idea of misframing history in America, and you oppose it, you tell the school board you disagree with it, you might get targeted now. Now, Garland directed the FBI and U.S. attorneys in the next 30 days to convene meetings with federal, state, and local leaders. Again, within 30 days to facilitate the discussion of strategies for addressing threats against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff, according to a letter sent to the Attorney General on October 4th to all U.S. attorneys. That letter is public. In other words, this isn't rumor. They're actually doing this. Now, on this note again, right, so they've sent out this letter to all U.S. attorneys, the FBI director and the director of executive office of U.S. attorneys and the assistant attorney general of the Department of Justice's criminal division, all involved with this. Now, according to the Department of Justice, further efforts will be rolled out in days. So they're not even done with it. It's not even just that initial step. Among the other efforts include a task force that will determine how to use federal resources to prosecute offending parents. So do you disagree with critical race theory? Are you protesting it? Are you addressing this with your school board? Are you unhappy as you address it? Well, folks, they're going to be doing this within 30 days, forming a task force and having all these other efforts across, again, Department of Justice Criminal Division, U.S. attorneys, Assistant Attorney General, FBI, and other branches looking into this. And they're saying as well as how to advise state entities on prosecutions in cases where no federal law is broken. Hear that, folks? Going after you with prosecutions, even if you have not violated federal law. Using federal government to go after you. Federal government, not local government. Federal government doing this to go after you for things that are not illegal under federal law. To prosecute you. Now, the Justice Department will also provide training to school staff on how to report threats from parents and preserve evidence to aid in investigations and prosecution. And they're saying, quote, in recent months, there has been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff who participate in the vital work of running our nation's public schools, Garland wrote. And folks, it's always important to pay attention to the way that language is used, because they're saying in recent months there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence. Now, most people's eyes would go to the last thing there, threats of violence. Yes, threats of violence, bad, right? Harassment, maybe not so much. What constitutes harassment? Again, if you're a school board leader and, for example, parents are holding protests, would that then constitute harassment within that definition? Probably, because that's actually what they've been writing about as one of the things that they're angry about. Angry parents protesting to the school boards, being wrapped up in all this. Now, Garland also writes this: while spirited debate about policy matters is protected under a constitution, that protection does not extend to threats of violence or efforts to intimidate individuals based on their views. And again, folks, they're wrapping up violence and intimidation within the big one here, which is harassment. And harassment in the form, very likely, of normal protest. Now, we'll see what they can do with this, because typically the Constitution does protect you, including in protesting government policy. And when it comes to the state financing a lot of these things, a lot of these people are technically state employees in a lot of cases. Very bizarre, folks. We'll see how it goes. We'll see what they do with this. But a couple of the big things here are, again, this is not limited to threats of violence. As the narrative goes forward, that is probably what you're going to be hearing the most of, that it's made to stop threats of violence. It is not limited to that. Also, they're looking to, again, have prosecutions against acts that do not violate federal law. Now, threats of violence, assault, things like that, that would violate the law. And so why are they specifically looking into things that do not violate federal law? If it does not, if it is actually just about what they are framing it as, right? If it is actually only within the bounds of what they're framing it as, something to stop violence and threats of violence and so on, right? Domestic terror threats, they're even claiming that it falls in that category. If it is only within that boundary, why would they need to get investigations into how to have prosecutions against acts that do not violate federal law? Because probably, folks, this is not actually about that. Probably this is about, again, parents protesting things like mask mandates, vaccine mandates, or parents who are just unhappy about the things being taught to their kids in schools. Currently happening, there was very quick action on this. That letter from the school board just came out. The U.S. Attorney's Office, they've acted immediately on this. The Department of Justice acted immediately. And within 30 days, they're going to be launching these 2 different programs. Now, imagine if they were this efficient at many other things, like, for example, stopping the 400,000 plus illegal immigrants expected at the border this month, or maybe testing them for the virus, and maybe enforcing the Supreme Court's ruling that they have to wait in Mexico if they want to have their cases checked for, again, amnesty. Maybe if they responded to threats like this, a lot of things would get done a lot quicker, but they're not. Which does say a lot, because it means that they view parents questioning state policy as a bigger deal than threats to the nation itself. Very interesting development. Now, folks, that said, as you have seen, we are still demonetized by YouTube. But luckily, we do have sponsors, and tonight's episode is brought to you by American Hartford Gold. And with the multi-trillion dollars in spending, we've been talking about it for a while, more multi-trillion in dollars in spending on the horizon, the stock market having issues, inflation already upon us, you can consider investing in an asset that tends to be both stable and on the incline, including oftentimes during states of economic crisis. That is gold and silver. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more, you can check out the link in the description below, where American Hartford Gold is providing a free 25-page information guide. And even if you just want to learn about investing in gold or silver, check it out, the link in the description. If you call them now as well, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver in all qualifying first orders. The phone number for that is 877-260-2764, where you can text Joshua to 65532. Now, interesting developments, interesting times we're in. Now, as the federal government is now working to investigate parents and find ways to prosecute them for things that don't violate federal crime, for example, for very likely holding protests at schools, in addition to things that actually do violate the law, such as making threats. As they're doing this and targeting parents, another interesting development is now taking place, which is allegedly, this is an article from Yahoo News, it says government secretly orders Google to track anyone searching certain names, addresses, and phone numbers. So, folks, if you thought that you were safe, whatever you're typing in Google, not being monitored, if you have typed certain keywords in Google, the government has allegedly secretly ordered Google to track you. And this is, again, public-private partnership in terms of monitoring, private business carrying out actions of monitoring American citizens that the federal government very likely would not be allowed to legally do unless they were to have a lot of different warrants. Again, what do you call it when the big corporate structures work hand in hand with totalitarian government? That is fascism, folks. And here we are. Now, let's go into this in just a bit. First off, though, the tea tonight is a Taiwanese mountain tea. It's very good. I highly recommend it. Now, folks, it says here, the U.S. government... Sorry, EX8, you're cracking me up. I said, Josh, it's too late for us. Your name is probably on that list. Yeah, they're not saying what the names are, but who knows? According to Milley, we may in fact be terrorists for that, based on what he's defining it as. We'll see. He did deny it on record, but we'll see. Now it says here, the U.S. government is reportedly secretly issuing warrants for Google to provide user data on anyone typing in certain search terms, raising fears that innocent online users could get caught up in serious crime investigations at a greater frequency than previously thought. Serious crime investigations for typing in certain keywords in Google. Now, in an attempt to track down criminals, they say, federal investigators have started using new keyword warrants. You hear that, folks? These are new. This is a new development. Keyword warrants. And use them to ask Google, right? They're asking Google to provide them information on anyone who searched a victim's name or their address during a particular year, or an accidentally unsealed court document that Forbes found shows. And this is according to Jennifer Granick, a surveillance and cybersecurity counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, not a right-wing organization by any means, the ACLU. They're saying this: trawling through Google's search history database enables police to identify people merely based on what they might have been thinking about for whatever reason at some point in the past. And it continues saying this: this never before possible technique threatens First Amendment interests and will inevitably sweep up innocent people, especially if keyword terms are not unique and the time frame not precise. To make matters worse, police are currently doing this in secret, which insulates the practice from public debate and regulation. Now, of course, there's a couple ways to think about this, right? If you think about normal policing, let's say, for example, there was maybe a murder on a certain date, and someone typed in the victim's name on the date of the murder or try to find the location or so on. The police might look for certain information who typed in the victim's name on that particular date to get an idea of someone searching for them and so on, right? It could be things like that. It could be things, for example, like them going on, a social media website and looking for the person on at a particular time. Things like this. The details are not fully known, but the concerning part here is that they have now started using essentially search terms and Google search terms and other information like this as potentially incriminating evidence against people. Now, this is, of course, getting the attention of the ACLU. They're mentioning this in context of normal policing. But to broaden the picture a bit, this is actually what they're doing to the people who were, at the Capitol building on January 6th as well. Whether you call it the Capitol siege or the Great Walkthrough, where people are getting just a little over a month in prison and sentences typically for trespassing. There's been no real serious criminal cases yet, even though people have been held without bail in solitary confinement sometime since the incidents took place. Folks, part of the investigation is currently being done on that. This committee formed in the House to investigate it. They claim it's a bipartisan committee. The only Republicans they brought on, remember Nancy Pelosi and the others, rejected the Republicans who would have actually represented the normal Republican interests. The ones they brought on to form the bipartisan, wording, were never Trumpers, people who voted to impeach Trump based on their interpretation of January 6th already, meaning, again, they had preformed notions and publicly stated notions about how they view the nature of the January 6th incident. That committee has been asking for information from different service providers, including social media outlets, including Google, Twitter, and so on, and including as well even Parler, the Donald, I think they call patriots.win now, and other websites that people who are conservative may have been browsing. Now, even just through providing that information, this House committee may actually be asking these organizations to be violating law even in doing so. But this is to raise the issue that information online, including information you may believe is private, such as what you're typing on Google, what you're searching for on a daily basis, what you're writing to your friends on messaging apps. All this information can and possibly will be used against you in a court of law, it seems. A concerning development when it comes to the idea of privacy on the internet. That said, folks, You might remember the story we were talking about. There was this Marine officer who, after the Afghan withdrawal, went and made a public video. And in the video states that he believes that he may lose his job because of it. He understands there may be repercussions for doing it. He does it anyway. He goes public, makes a video, and he says, in normal situations in the military, if someone does something stupid and they get people killed, if they ignore intelligence, if they ignore information that, possibly causes loss of life or causes an incident to go, really far south, the individuals who made those calls will typically be held accountable. That could take many forms. This individual specifically, this officer in the Marines, was specifically talking about the bad withdrawal from Afghanistan, where, unlike a normal withdrawal taking place, they evacuated the military first and abandoned a lot of American citizens and people in the country who had supported the United States, leaving many of them to die, and caused, of course, a lot of chaos at the airport, which led to many U.S. service members being killed in a suicide attack. Now, in a normal situation, somebody would be held accountable, particularly the people who made the bad call that allowed that poor withdrawal to take place. And there'd be an investigation on what calls and what incidents led to it being done as badly as it was. Now, do you think these individuals were taken to prison or investigated because of it? Because again, he's raising a good point, is normally officers would be held accountable. Does that also apply to the people higher up in the command chain? What happened? The officer, this individual who raised that point, was thrown in the brig, thrown in military prison. He himself was thrown in prison for stating that. But folks, a lot of support got behind him, and Lieutenant Colonel Scheller is now freed, although he is still facing charges. Now, contrast this, for example, with General Milley, who essentially admitted in some regards to on what could be constituted as treason. Remember that General Flynn, even on things that weren't as severe as what Milley admitted to, Milley was, advising our enemies, the Chinese Communist Party, about U.S. defense policy behind the backs of the president himself, the commander-in-chief himself. When General Flynn had done something not even nearly as bad, accused of things based on false intelligence, context of which he had been in Russia and so on, accused of things that he later admitted to under threats because he believed, again, there was a lot of parts to it, basically false information raised. I don't want to get into the whole story of it. But folks, the left, many organizations were calling for Flynn to be held accountable on that possibly even charged with treason. Milley himself did what Flynn was accused of doing in a lot of ways. And folks, he is off scot-free. Nothing happened with him. But contrast that with Lieutenant Colonel Scheller, it's an interesting contrast. Now, briefly on this, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller has been freed from pre-trial detention, but could still face charges for criticizing senior military officials over the U.S. evacuation from Afghanistan, the Epoch Times has learned. Scheller was scheduled for a pre-trial confinement initial review hearing Tuesday. Military officials plan to conduct the hearing in secret, sparking anger from social media outlets and members of the public. But prior to the hearing, the Marine Corps agreed to free Scheller, canceling the pretrial review as a result, according to a source familiar with the matter. The anonymous source, take it for what it's worth again, but it's Epoch Times. I think they typically do check their sources pretty well. Meanwhile, Scheller has submitted a request for resignation of his commission in lieu of trial to the Secretary of the Navy, the source said as well, speaking under condition of anonymity to avoid backlash from the military, possibly to avoid the same kind of backlash that Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller is now facing. Scheller could still face trial by court-martial, the source said as well. So we'll see what happens with Lieutenant Colonel Scheller. I will keep you updated on his case. Bizarre stuff, folks. Now, again, just to mention, if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. Around the halfway point, we'll get to them, so in just a little bit. I want to go over one more story before we jump into the questions. And I have another big announcement for you later, so stick around. All right, I'll wait. I'll wait before I announce it. Now, folks, first up, before we go into questions, I want to go into another story. Dr. Francis Collins, that's Dr. Fauci's boss, essentially, has now stepped down as head of the NIH. And it says here, the head of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, the NIH, is stepping down amid lingering questions regarding his agency's funding of research in China. Dr. Francis Collins has served as NIH director for over 12 years in a tenure that has spanned 3 administrations. And the story continues a bit further in, stating, NIH includes a number of offices, including the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the head of that office, has become one of the most prominent public health voices during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Collins, the individual who has now stepped down, has backed Fauci on a number of occasions, but both officials have come under scrutiny for statements regarding the origins of the CCP virus and funding given through their organizations to Chinese researchers, specifically at, again, the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak. Now, the officials deny the funding was for a type of research called gain of function, but scientists, including Dr. Richard Ebright, have said documents made public this year undermine those claims, meaning, again, that Fauci and others may have lied on record through doing so. Now, the technical detail they're using here is they did not use the term gain of function research in the request forms in the documents, but they used the definition of gain of function research. Imagine in a normal court case, the individual does not use a particular word for something, but writes the definition of that word. Would it still be considered something within that context? Probably. But that's the nature, essentially, of them claiming it's misinformation or whatever. Now, Collins and Fauci, both of them, Collins stepping down, Fauci not yet, were untruthful when they claimed before Congress that the NIH did not support gain-of-function research or potential pandemic pathogen enhancement at the Wuhan lab, Ebright said last month. Fauci and Collins have, quote, broken trust with the American people. And 3 Republicans said that around the same time. Interesting developments, folks. It does seem to be the case that things are getting closer and closer to them on the investigation into the origins of this virus. The type of funding that was being given to these organizations that had previously been banned in the United States, but was being done with these organizations, and admissions by individuals tied to this research, talking about the nefarious nature of gain-of-function research, specifically the type they were funding in China at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other similar organizations around the same area. Again, ground zero of the CCP virus, COVID-19. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions. So if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. First of all, though, I want to mention we have now released the 5th and final, for now, episode of the Dark Origins of Communism series. I've been talking for a long time about doing the series, finally out there and finally done. Check out episode 5 on Epoch TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. You can check out the link to that in the description below this video. Be sure to check it out. Again, episode 5 is now out. That is the last episode for now. I do want to do more, but I have a few other things I want to get to first. But again, folks, check it out. Link in the description below. We'll show you a quick trailer now of that. Under the communist system of dialectical materialism, everything in the universe amounts to nothing more than matter in motion. That means you and I are only clumps of physical cells. Our souls, emotions, mental health, and well-being are not part of the communist equation. Like how the moderate Girondins were among the first to die in the French Revolution, or how moderate Democrats are shut out by the Democratic Socialists of America. Communism favors the extremes. In traditional culture, it is 2 opposite elements working together in harmony to form a whole. However, this was inversed under the Chinese Communist Party. In the selected works of Mao Zedong, the yin-yang, which is normally a whole, is split into 2, with each side constantly fighting and struggling against the other. and either the Eastern or Western spiritual view of the world. The course of human life serves to temper the character of the soul. An atheistic, materialistic reading of the world is that only matter or progress exists. Communism does not want you to have a soul. All right, again, that's episode 5. Be sure to check it out in the link in the description below. Also, if you don't have an account with Epic TV, all you need to watch it with a free trial is an email address. So be sure to check it out, folks. Link in the description below. All right, folks. That said, let's jump into questions. First one here is from the one and only Pinky Pinkin. Good seeing you here. You said there are now COVID camps in Washington State and Tennessee, and they are now hiring for them in California. Is there any word on Bill A416 in New York? I have not heard word about them moving on this. We'll have to see. Keep in mind, I know it sounds far-fetched, folks, the idea of people being thrown in quarantine camps of some kind. Remember, this was actually part of the original COVID policy, though. I remember we went over this in a previous episode. In fact, I showed you all the original document on it. I can't remember which organization was under. It was either FEMA or FDA. I want to say it was FEMA, but don't hold me to that. We talked about in a previous video. I did show you the original document on it. Essentially, they had 3 different tiers in terms of confinement. The most basic tier of confinement would be, for example, lockdown within your home, which they did do. Remember, last year they did in fact have in-home quarantine. They did in fact do that. So tier 1 did happen. Yeah, FEMA. That was FEMA, I believe. Tier 1 of that did happen. Tier 2 would have been a communal type thing. Would have to lock down a community. Tier 3 would have been actual camps. And that was proposed as a potential option for dealing with the CCP virus. Now, again, in the United States, we only saw tier 1 of that used. The actual documents did list all 3 tiers as potential options. And if you remember as well that in China, all 3 tiers of that were in fact put into place. The Chinese Communist Party did have camps. Remember the hospital they built in Wuhan, China? They rapidly built this quarantine hospital. And it turned out that a lot of people were getting sick in the hospital itself because it was so rapidly built. There were a lot of issues with it. That was a camp. That was in fact practiced in China. Also, the idea of in-home lockdown and of communal lockdown, that was the CCP's main policy. Keep in mind, folks, a lot of the policies being run around the world, the entire idea that mask mandates work, the entire idea that lockdown policies work, even the idea of the passport vaccine mandate, the vaccine passport, that started with the Chinese Communist Party's phone health code. The CCP's model is the model being used to, again, try to stop this virus. And the very idea that it functions as a model is based on the fact that the Chinese Communist Party was lying to the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization was lying to the rest of the world, and anybody who said otherwise is being censored. Remember, Facebook, YouTube, other websites were saying that they would censor you if you gave COVID misinformation, and their definition of that was pretty much anybody who said anything outside of the boundaries of what the WHO was saying, as the WHO was, again, lying on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. A few other levels to that, including some of these different science magazines that were, again, also lying on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And it turned out many of the scientists making those claims were actually taking money from China. Very bizarre stuff. But to answer your question again, we haven't seen them doing anything actionable in terms of camps and quarantine camps, but they have listed them in publicly available reports as an option. And I have seen also articles about them hiring for positions that do appear to fit that description. In fact, I did in fact look at even some of the hiring posts. And so, yes, not only have they listed this as an option, they have actually been hiring for posts that do fit a description that could suggest that. Next question is from CK. He said, what, if anything, can we the people do to stop the FBI from declaring parents domestic terrorists? Can we sue the FBI? Okay, this is purely speculative and purely based on my analysis. So take it for what it's worth. Personally, I think a lot of this is just, ironically, because they're saying it's to stop intimidation. Frankly, I think a lot of this is just glorified government intimidation, meant to make parents not want to go and protest at school boards and so on. Because what you're going to very likely watch is media organizations, all the legacy media, attacking parents and labeling them and taking one or two parents who get sued or charged by the FBI and dragging them around essentially as the to tar and feather as the poster boys of domestic terror threats. Look at these domestic terrorists, parents who disagree with the vaccine mandates. They want to send their kids to school and infect other kids and kill grandma or whatever. That's the way I see the narrative playing out. Typically, that is how they would operate with this. Whether or not the parents in the end, are found guilty by the federal government is actually inconsequential to the idea of a narrative like that. And let me explain. A lot of the ways that the media works, media brainwashing, psychological warfare, which is not necessarily lying to you, but more like altering the way you interpret information, is actually through emotional memory. And this is interesting when you get into it. I could get into some books of this. This is like classic Pavlov theory, right? You get this dog, and it was this Russian scientist Pavlov who was working under Lenin and basically looking into ways on how to brainwash people. They took a dog, they tied it up with harnesses and so on. They fed the dog food. They rang a bell. The dog begins associating food with the bell, and they find that when they ring the bell, the dog salivates as if food was going to be there, even though no food is presented. In the same way, you can make people develop essentially unconscious reactions on an emotional level. And a lot of people develop emotional memory connected to stimuli, just like the dog had the stimuli of the food. The stimuli in this case would be social issues, narratives, media narratives, COVID lockdowns, vaccine passports, all these different narratives they want to push. The way that media does it is they tell you 1,000 lies. They just barrage you with lies. It doesn't matter in the end if the lies get proven false. A lot of times they do get proven false, and the media never even corrects them. The people, a lot of times, because they're being lied to constantly, because they're being emotionally agitated constantly, they begin to have unconscious emotional reactions to stimuli, set issues such as policy, such as the kids in cages narrative, even though the whole thing was fake, even though it was an Obama era policy, and even though the kids in cages at the Mexican border was actually, the photos were from a protest, not an actual kids in cages thing. And then he had AOC doing her photo op, breaking down, crying in front of a fence, which turned out to not be in front of kids in cages. It turned out to be in front of a parking lot. That is things like that you barrage people with these narratives, you feed them sob stories. They have emotional reactions, and over time they begin associating those emotional reactions with the political issues, just like a dog would associate the salivation with food, with the sound of a bell. Same thing. And so, on the note of, again, them declaring parents domestic terrorists, the really idea of this, in my analysis, based on the way these things typically happen, is that the main idea of the school board doing this isn't necessarily to have every parent arrested, I would assume. Instead, it's very likely to do shock and awe tactics, to make examples of parents, to give them media fodder, to make these parents out to be bad guys, so that nobody wants to question the policies or what is being taught to their kids. Because doing so means you're putting your neck on the chopping block, because they can use a couple parents as examples and make examples of them, putting your neck on the chopping block, and you might not want to do it. That's the idea, typically, the way these things work. And especially because if they did it on too large of a scale, very likely the pushback would be too great and they wouldn't be able to endure it. And frankly, it probably can't hold up in the court of law either, especially if the media, like us, cover it. Another question here from Christine Villers. It says, how does school mess work if we pay taxes and technically they are our employees and our community property? Sounds like they're speaking out of turn. And where will manpower come from as all the quit due to clot shot tyranny for enforcement? I'm sorry. I believe. Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're saying essentially, how does it work with schools enforcing policies like this when again they're funded by taxpayers' money? Well, typically, I mean, in the United States, one of the foundations of our government is the ability of you to have free speech. Again, what constitutes our government, the Constitution. The Bill of Rights does give you free speech, including the right to protest, including, in fact, even seditious speech is protected, something a lot of people don't know about. In fact, the Aliens and Seditious Act, I believe it was called, Aliens and Sedition Act, was one of the first laws against this passed in the United States. Thomas Jefferson actually tossed it out when he became president. The Aliens and Sedition Act was later ruled by the Supreme Court on many occasions to have been unconstitutional. In other words, even seditious speech is protected in the United States. In fact, even the very foundation of communism, and look at how popular communism now is, the idea of violent revolution and violent overthrow of government and the forcible overthrow of all existing institutions. By its very nature, if seditious speech was not allowed, communism wouldn't even be allowed to be debated. This is, of course, selective enforcement of such policies, and frankly, the presenting of policies in ways that really assume people don't have this background knowledge of their rights and the degree to which their rights can be upheld. Again, I don't think people are making seditious speech here. Making threats is another thing. If you are making threats, don't make threats. But again, just protesting policies, angrily stating your disapproval to what's being taught to your kids. In any normal case, this would never be considered seditious speech or domestic terror threats or so on, and very likely would not be in the court of law, even if they tried to. Again, I would put this essentially within the boundaries of shock and awe tactics. They want to frame you as terrorists, and they want to make you too afraid to speak out. Essentially, is what I'm getting from this. Again, that's my analysis. Take it for what it's worth, as usual. Another question here from Lins99. You said, do you think the $600, I'll get into that. Do you think the $600 amount the IRS will be looking for has anything to do with what the government has been supplementing non-workers with, as they may believe that we will be equitable for all, and that is all that we plebeians need? Hard to say. Yeah. So again, you're asking whether the supplement, the federal supplement being given to unemployment benefits and so on, was essentially $600 in some cases. I believe they're giving more in other cases. But folks, basically the Biden administration has now ordered the IRS to begin basically monitoring any transactions over $600. Now, previously, the FBI would typically not look at anything, or the IRS, I'm sorry, would not look at anything below $50,000. $50,000 transactions of $50,000 and above would typically be investigated for possible criminal wrongdoing. Now it's $600 and above. Now, there's a few different things to this. On one note, probably this is going to make it very hard for them to monitor for actual crimes, especially as they begin enforcing vaccine mandates, and you have maybe 20, 30, 40% of the staff have to quit or take unpaid indefinite leave. We'll have to see. But at the same time, it's the IRS, and typically one of the most efficient branches of government is the one that takes your money from you. They're very efficient at it. I think it's actually the best thing the government does. They're really good at it. Enforcing policies through the IRS to take your money. They tend to be very efficient with that. This is, of course, looking at transactions. The context of why they're doing this is not quite clear. Again, why do they make it so $600 and above would set off a red flag essentially with the IRS? There's a few different possibilities to this. One would be people getting paid under the table. For example, if you're a worker and you don't want to get the vaccine, and so maybe your boss agrees to pay you under the table, and you're getting, let's say, $2,000 a month or something like that, or whatever minimum wages for that, they'd be able to monitor that. And so it could be they're looking for people getting paid under the table and things of that nature. Again, this is just assuming the context of $600 is not being made clear. They claim that it's to, again, root out the wealthy elite trying to hide their finances and so on. Typically, folks, the wealthy elite, I would imagine, are not making $600 transactions to hide their wealth. But essentially, this is how it's being framed. Another question here from Shannon Haney. He said, have you heard about that the Treasury Department was actually seriously considering minting a $1 trillion platinum coin and depositing it into the government treasury? Is that even possible? Let me get into that. Yes, they were talking about this. So as the government nears the debt ceiling, because they've borrowed more money than they can actually borrow, they can't borrow any more money. Our money, this comes from the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor reserve and prints our money, and controls inflation and controls interest rates, and is bailed out using your money. The Federal Reserve essentially is what's doing this, right? Now, they were talking about a way to avoid the need to raise the debt ceiling because Republicans don't want to do it. There's even a lot of infighting among Democrats over it. Now, they essentially need to raise the debt ceiling to keep spending irresponsibly, to keep spending in ways that they can't pay it back. And of course, a lot of their policies, a lot of their agendas require that type of spending. One of the ways they presented, this came from Pelosi, talking about possible ways to get around raising the debt ceiling, would be to print these $1 trillion platinum coins. And keep in mind, they probably wouldn't spend this. But what that means is this. The way that money works, the printing of money works, is it's essentially, printing of money is essentially like, well, it leads to inflation, but it's essentially a hidden tax. Imagine, for example, that you have, let's use a random example. You have 10 pineapples, right? And forgive me for being ridiculous. You have 10 pineapples, and the value of those pineapples, let's say you give pineapple certificates where it's, free pineapple certificates. You have 10 of them, right? Now, each certificate is worth 1 pineapple. Now, let's say that, it's not necessarily one free pineapple. It's 1,000 points and it buys you a pineapple or something like that, right? These certificates that do that. Now, what happens when you double the amount of those certificates? It means you now need 2 certificates to get a pineapple, even though the number written on the certificate is the same. And if you print another 1,000, whatever, eventually, even though the amount of pineapples remains the same, the amount of tickets you need to purchase those pineapples increases because the value of the tickets themselves have been reduced. That is the way inflation works. Now, to now use a more direct example of this, imagine you have $10,000 in the bank. You've been saving it for your future. You want to retire one day. You're hoping you don't have to work when you're older. Now, that $10,000, they print more money. Inflation doubles every 10 years, roughly. That means that the value, the tangible value, even though the numbers and the bills remain the same, the tangible value of the money you have in the bank has been reduced by 1/2. If inflation doubles, the value of your money is reduced by 1/2. And this is the way that they take your money from you, dollar by dollar, every time they print a new bill. Every time they print a new bill, they take more of your money from you because they're messing with the actual value of the money itself. If they begin printing $1 trillion coins, essentially what that means is they have the printing presses going full speed, nonstop, constantly printing new money, constantly reducing the value of the money you have in the bank. And essentially this means that even that is not fast enough. Even that is not running fast enough. And so they need to print, again, larger bills that would essentially, be equivalent to more money than is even thought possible. It's important to note that on the idea of printing $1 trillion platinum coin, the White House did block that. They claim now they're not considering doing it. So take it for what it's worth. Real quick as well, one question first. This is from Truth Seeker. He said, Joshua, are your communist episodes each less than 20 minutes, or am I watching introductions to a longer version? I'm a member of Epoch TV. Yeah, so the communism episodes, the Dark Origins of Communism series, they're roughly 7 to 10 minutes each, some a bit longer, some a bit shorter. So combined, maybe 45 minutes for the whole series. And again, it's 5 episodes, and I'm hoping to do more. We'll have to see if we do more. So yeah, if you're watching those, you should be watching the full versions. Real quick, folks, before I forget, also, you might have seen that Project Veritas, which again does undercover journalism, they had some very interesting videos looking into the Pfizer. Pfizer is a company, and they had undercover videos of multiple scientists at Pfizer discussing natural immunity, the efficacy of the vaccines, and giving advice to people based on this, even including statements claiming that they themselves had to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, where they can't make these statements public. They can't talk about these things publicly, although they admit to a lot of really crazy things in these undercover recordings. They admit to things, for example, stating that they feel everything is being monitored within these vaccine manufacturing companies. They claim that basically the entire companies are now being run on COVID money. And essentially, they even say it openly that the whole thing is pretty much a money-making scheme. One of the guys says he believes he's working for a giant evil corporation. And even the idea of natural immunity, multiple scientists say that it's more effective than the vaccines themselves, even though they were not able to say this publicly. Highly recommend watching that video. I know that Project Veritas is deeply attacked. A lot of times people write it off. They say, it's disinformation, surreptitious recording or whatever. First of all, surreptitious recording, such as what they do, is actually approved under the Journalism Code of Ethics, only in cases where you could not get the information through normal means. And so even according to Journalism Code of Ethics, Society of Professional Journalists and so on, the type of journalism they do is actually an approved form of journalism under certain conditions, which what they do meets. At the same time, they give enough context where they show the full context of statements that the idea of taking things out of context, it's nonsense, frankly. I do recommend watching it. Of course, James O'Keefe has already been blocked from Facebook for posting this, for posting statements of actual scientists at these companies saying in their own words things that violate the standards of these websites that are telling you to listen to the science, while scientists are the ones they're censoring, ironically. Highly recommend watching it, folks. I can't show it here because they'd probably delete our channel if I showed it, but be sure to check it out. You can find that on the Project Veritas website. I do highly recommend it. Again, last question here, then we'll go into something interesting I have for you all. This is from CK Dumb. You say, question, if the debt ceiling is not raised and we default, is that really a bad thing? Is that really be a bad thing? If it makes it more expensive to borrow, wouldn't it push government to get our spending under control? Short-term loss, long-term win? There's mixed analysis on it. Of course, they're saying a lot of people who work for the government will lose their job. A lot of people would also argue the government is significant. The federal government in particular is significantly larger than was ever imagined by our founding fathers. It would be unfortunate to have massive unemployment, again, because of government employees losing their jobs, and I'm not sure what that means for pensions, frankly. But again, you do have a lot of bloat within our government. It's gone incredibly far beyond anything the founding fathers would have ever imagined. And it also doesn't mean that the U.S. system stops working in any way, of course. Keep in mind, for example, that in the United States, every state is essentially its own government as well, including its own military, which would be the National Guard. In terms of them being shut down, it wouldn't last because, again, this is the debt ceiling. This is not the normal budget issue. This is not like facing government shutdown because they can't get a budget through. It's not that. Just to make this clear, it's specifically about this is different from a government shutdown because they can't pass a budget. This is government defaulting on its loans to the Federal Reserve and things like this. Because again, they can't borrow any more money. They can't overspend anymore. They've spent trillions of dollars within even just the past year, and they can't keep spending like this essentially because they've reached the limit of it. Now, of course, normal fiscal policy, you would look at how to fix things like this and get yourself out of debt, not get yourself deeper into debt. such as, for example, with a $1.1 trillion infrastructure bill and another $3.5 spending bill they want to get through. You wouldn't come close to almost doubling the debt. Not doubling, but creating an additional half of the existing debt in addition to something you already can't afford. You wouldn't normally do that. And so from a certain standpoint, it actually might be a good thing if they do default. And frankly, the federal government in particular needs to get its spending under control. Frankly, also, in terms of what they're doing for the American people right now, I don't know what they're doing for the American people right now. Maybe having a brief hiatus to see, what they're actually spending our money on would be nice. We'll see. At the same time, though, I do hope that they keep the military funded because, and this is my analysis, I do hope they do because, frankly, the Chinese Communist Party is really flexing its muscles right now and becoming a lot more aggressive. And frankly, as we mentioned previously, Xi Jinping, the head of the CCP itself, he has ordered his military to prepare for war. And they've been making statements similar to this all through the pandemic. Things are pretty serious right now. And so I would say you look at it on a U.S. national level, but also look at it in terms of global international security, especially as the CCP itself is also probably nearing a financial crisis. I would hope the U.S. can weather this crisis and maybe survive where the CCP doesn't. Because you're going to have essentially a big clashing of systems taking place. And frankly, I don't know how this is going to work if the U.S. defaults and the CCP defaults or collapses economically around the same time. We'll see. It's going to be interesting to watch because, again, this is untrodden territory. All right, folks. That said, I have a special announcement for all of you. I asked you all a question in a recent episode not too long ago. In particular, I asked you, what do you all think about starting a book club? You like that idea? And a lot of you said, I would love the idea of starting a book club. Let's do it. Well, folks, I'm happy to announce today the start of the Crossroads Book Club. And the book for October is going to be Debunking the 1619 Project, Exposing the Plan to Divide America by Mary Grabar. So pick up your copy. I'm already ahead of you all. I'm already reading through it. Highly, highly recommended, even if you don't want to join our book club. Check it out. You can get it at Regnery if you don't want to support Amazon. I know a lot of you don't like Amazon. You can buy it directly through the publisher, Regnery, Regnery, I believe. You can buy it directly through them. Highly recommended as well. This is, again, Mary Grabar's Debunking the 1619 Project. Now, I've been reading through it. You can see my book is heavily earmarked because I'm using it for notes. Some of you might be horrified at seeing that. It's kind of my weird note-taking system. But it's a very good book. Essentially, it goes through step by step and brings up all the facts, alleged facts, all the statements presented by the New York Times 1619 Project and debunks them. And as you read it, you will see how much history has been falsified by the New York Times and its 1619 Project, and how much education is lying to your children by presenting them with this false information. It does a very good job. Mary Grabar does a fantastic job laying out the real history, showing statements in their full context, and explaining how the New York Times has lied to its readers and lied to children across the United States through, again, the 1619 Project, which they have brought into American education. So, folks, one of the greatest foundations of this country, right? We are a republic, a constitutional republic, founded on the idea that American citizens are able to cast their votes and choose their own leaders. We're a nation of kings, as was previously described by individuals like G.K. Chesterton. Now, a constitutional republic like this depends on an informed population, an informed public making informed decisions. And I would say that a lot of the information is being choked out, essentially. A lot of the information has been strangled out, falsified, and so on, to make sure that an uninformed public is making uninformed decisions. And the greatest antidote to that, I believe, is good information. So join us on our book club. Book for October, Again, Debunking the 1619 Project, Mary Graybar. And we don't currently have a platform for the book club, so I'll probably dedicate some of the show, maybe every Sunday we'll do it. Towards the end, we can talk about the book and share ideas. Maybe eventually we'll look into some other options. We'll see. And we might figure out some other things as well. In the process, but officially announcing it now, the Crossroads Book Club is now official. All right, folks, that said, it's getting a bit late, so I'll call it a night here. I want to show you as well, we did a really interesting interview as well. Remember we were talking about these Navy SEALs who are standing up against the vaccine mandates within the military. They believe that, again, that they're being targeted. These are individuals applying for religious exemption and medical exemption to the vaccines, and they are standing up against these policies, approaching lawyers to help them do so. We sat down for an interview with one of these lawyers. It is R. Davis Younts, and I'll show you the trailer for that in just a bit, folks, so be sure to check it out. It's exclusively, the whole interview is exclusively on Epoch TV, so check out the link to that in the description below. We'll show you a trailer in just a minute, folks, but first of all, as always, pleasure having you all here. Thanks again. As always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you. A group of Navy SEALs has been told that they are undeployable unless they get the COVID-19 vaccine.
One of their main concerns is the sense that they have a conviction to be very careful and thoughtful what they put into their bodies. Why is this vaccine being treated differently? We don't have long-term 5 and 10 year safety studies on the mRNA vaccine.
Other vaccines, natural immunity is recognized as an exemption?
Correct. For this, the orders coming out from the Pentagon to my clients in writing are natural immunity is not a recognized exemption. Even if you have natural immunity, you must still get this vaccine.
Military in 3 different points doesn't seem to be following its own protocols on this.
There's differences with this vaccine and there's questions that aren't answered yet.